Good afternoon. Welcome to the Assembly's work session regarding review of processes for bonds, capital improvement plans, and capital improvement budget. It's Friday, the 21st of April. It is 1:12 p.m. We'll start by going around the room having member introductions.
Joey Sweet,
Felix Rivera.
Anna Brawley.
Scott Myers,
Daniel Voland.
Christopher Constant.
Robin Dern.
Deanna's.
Yeah, we'll come to others in a minute, but no, Mr. Cross, members first.
Oh, Kevin Cross.
Pete Peterson.
Mute. Karen Bronga. Unmute.
Zach Johnson.
So we're in the midst of our transition process. We have members-elect and members at the table. Also from the staff, we have Attorney Deannis, who's providing some consulting on this. And we have, want to say your name for the record?
Marilyn Bonsoff, Deputy Director, Office of Management and Budget.
Thank you. All right, we also have some members from legislative, clerk staff, and legal. So who is going to take the lead? Ms. Ennis, you're recognized.
Yes, Legislative Services and the Clerk's Office asked me months ago to try to get something together for some training for the new members on the budget process, even though most of your training starts next week. I smartly conned Marilyn Banzoff of OMB, both materials and the initial presentation. My line to her was, I can read these words, but after the fourth error, you're going to have to jump in anyway. And they said they were very thrilled that I allowed them to do this. So very grateful that they're going to start with the Maryland with a number of overview training materials. My idea here, and I think the Legislative Services was, let's impart some basic information to the members who must be a little overwhelmed after the last work session. And give them some basic information, and for current and departing members to then impart wisdom, but I figure the training portion should take less than an hour. So if you have helpful comments, but then at the end, turn it over for some of the things that happened last year, like the whole Parks and Rec bond and how that happened and when things were submitted. So I hope the first part of this is fairly easy way to impart information to the new members, but then we'll open up the floor to everybody for comments and suggestions and concerns. So with that, this, again, to my right is Marilyn Banzoff. She and I worked together for about 15 years in the administration, and I told the new members I was the former deputy municipal attorney and ethics officer for the city for the same period of time. Marilyn was one of my go-to people. Anytime I needed help, she and I sat down at her whiteboard and worked things out. So she was one of my key people that I got information from. So I'm very, very grateful that they spent the time, especially given that they had the presentation this morning and a number of budget deadlines in the last week or two. So with that, here's Marilyn.
Thank you, Dee. That was a lot to live up to.
If I could add one more comment, she also has the best candy in the city.
Hello.
The best candy in her office in the city. It is, I would visit her quite regularly.
Thank you for the opportunity to present to you a overview of the capital budget process. When we develop the budget or the capital budget, it is truly a process that has activity that in it that has been developed over many years. But what I'm going to show you is the steps of a current year budget process. We have handouts for you. The handouts are also included in our budget publications, and within the handouts, within the handouts are identified the timing of when the publications come to you and to the public. So I'll start with a narrative sheet, and it's the capital overview. And this is, like I said, a narrative sheet that we do include in our capital budget publication. And actually, I want to back up one more step to say that this is for the general government capital budget process. It is basically followed also with the, by the utilities and enterprise, but this is specific to the general government at this time. Our overview first starts with what we consider a capital project. There's dollar limits, and there's also limits on what we consider to be a type of a capital infrastructure. And part of identifying this project, what the projects are, help us also identify or determine the allowable funding source for those projects. So it is important to understand what the capital project is, so then we can then go also identify allowable funding sources. I'm going on to the next bit, the budget. With the budget process, we talk CIB and CIP. CIB is the capital improvement budget, and that's the budget we're typically working on for the next year, for just that year itself. It'll set the projects that are approved for that next year. The capital improvement program looks at 6 years out, so next year plus 5 years out. So we may see that projects in the capital improvement program, which is 6 years out, may not necessarily be also in the capital improvement budget. Planning process. So the planning process, we go into a narrative of the planning process. But if I may, what I'd like to actually do is switch from the narrative bit to a couple pictures that we have. We have a one sheet of a picture that shows, is meant to show a graphic picture of how the budget process works. And then we also have, so we'll start with that. And what this shows is there are 3 blocks. The first block is just the budget process. And then what kind of spits out from that block is the next block of the bond funding for the projects that were approved for bond funding, and then also the state funding for the process for the bonds and the process for the state funding for the projects that were approved in the budget process. If you look at this graph, it shows that the capital budget process basically starts in March. We start with rolling out the community council, I believe it's the previous community council. Capital programs are available for the community councils to review, amend, and approve. They then they provide their input back to the city, and then so that happens. The community councils are surveys are available in March. April, May is when the community councils then work those proposed budgets. Then we stop that process, and we then work internally in the administration, where integrated with the CIP. So I'm going to go backward a little bit. So we have the CIP from the prior year. So our capital improvement plan from 23 through 5 years out, it included a component of 2024. So that will be the internal administration's starting point for the 2024 CIB. And then then we integrate community council recommendations and department recommendations, and they go through the administrative approval process. And then once that process is completed, it is then presented to the public and the assembly for the next public step of the process.
Can I interrupt?
Absolutely.
I just wondered from the assembly people, and maybe ask Chris, because you're all attached to a community council in general, when this has happened, how are you involved in that? Are you notified directly by OMB or because you're part of the council? So how are you part of that process, this early planning thing?
So this is an area of sensitivity for those of us who've come through community council processes because councils are notified of their participation in the CIP planning process. But every year, the software, the place on the web, the app preloads all kinds of projects that have nothing to do with the council's interests. Annually, the same projects show back up. The council has attempted to delete them. And then somehow, like magic, those priorities that they marked down or deleted show up as their highest priorities if their lists show up at all through the process. And so I personally, several times, updated the list through the app and then was told after we submitted, it was never submitted. And so, and this isn't a Maryland problem. This is a major problem that Lance and I have talked about over the years. And so some councils are able to get theirs up and in, many are not, even though they've done the work to get them there. And so I've instructed my councils to submit to me a parallel document like a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet that details the same issues, but it isn't a good system and it's been in need of a major upgrade for years. And so practically speaking, the notice goes out in the early spring. You need to get it back March, April, and they do their best.
Excuse me. And part of the purpose of this meeting is to identify some of these problem areas, but also to help the new members, how do you get involved in this? And so it's at the community council level is what you're telling me, Chris, but the documents are loaded somewhere on the web, and then that's where the breakdown comes, or? It's
really hard to say. It is a black box that doesn't reflect the will of the community. Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. Just to add to that, having also been involved in the community council process, obviously not on the assembly side yet, it is certainly a frustration, especially projects that councils have, commented on for years and years that this is not appropriate. So it's unclear. It does feel like it's unclear where and how that input gets selected. And then also just to flag, community councils are supposed to represent neighborhoods and the public, but I don't see anything on here that says public comment this early in the process. And then knowing that by the time you get to October, November, at what point does somebody who maybe is not engaged in their council as of March or April be able to provide input on that? And so, again, I think that's a bigger question about community councils, is how to make them more representative and how to make them in good faith represent the public. But that's another issue for sure.
And just briefly, this conversation, it's an introduction and we're having a discussion, and there is going to be a conversation about how do we make it better. And and I have stated my intent to see the calendar completely shift forward in time so that some of this work is being done earlier. Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you. I think one of the key missing pieces for my community councils, I have 9, and they all have varying intersections with this, is kind of notice from the MOA that, like, hey, you better get engaged in this process. We notice community councils about so many things, alcohol licenses, marijuana licenses. Like, why couldn't we actually notice them about this, like, proactive, great thing they could bring to their area? So they're scrambling. Some have it like on routine and they have a CIP committee. But a lot of them in trying to do what Ms. Brawley was saying, try to put out like a survey, like, are our priorities, like, rank our priorities again. Are they the priorities? Do you have additional projects you want to do? But it sneaks up on them because they really need to start in January in order to meet the deadline by May. And very few do. Mr. Rivera and I start mentioning it when we haven't heard them talk about it in March and say, hey, are you working on your CIP list? Make sure you get your projects in. So I think that that's really an important aspect. How can the municipality more proactively engage? Thanks.
Anyone else? No? Okay, go ahead. You.
Chris? I just wonder if I could ask Marilyn, but the survey gets developed in March, but not necessarily sent out then? Because it says on this calendar, community council survey developed.
Thank you, Dee. To my understanding, the community council survey is made available by March 31st. And then I do believe The intent is typically to have the community council, the administration's community council liaison attend each community council meeting to let them know that the process has started.
And just from a practical perspective, mayors from time to time do send people to those meetings. And maybe the new one will be great because she's pretty gung ho. But historically, that's a limited response option. It definitely devolves or resolves to the members to speak up most of the time, in my experience, at least in the councils in my district. Ms. Elatoa.
And is it a survey or is it access to the portal to put your projects in? Because I'm a little bit confused where those two things intersect.
It is one and the same.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And so that's a bit of a misnomer because a lot of community councils do send out their own internal survey to try to engage. And so they're like, well, we did the survey. No, now you have to vote on the results of your survey, pass that through. And some community councils we need to keep in mind have a 2-meeting notice. Several of mine do. You have to introduce it in one meeting and then the following month it's eligible for voting. So they really do, if you back that time up from the end of May, then they have to have voted in potentially April, depending on when their May meeting is. And so you can back up into the front of the year pretty quickly. Thanks.
All of that's to say that the process is in development and is worthy of some time to make it better.
Can I just ask one question, Marilyn? So the portal/survey, is that just, is there a lot of work for that, or is that just pulling forward the year before?
I will say nothing. As easy as most things seem simple, rarely they are. But yes, Dee, I believe your characterization of what needs to be done is what does get done, but it does take some complexity, some time and work to do. It involves, typically OMB, typically IT, and some time to work the process, to get the website up to have the current year's data on it.
Thank you.
And again, it's so many hands go into those documents. The council puts up their response and then it's amended somehow magically by some unknown actor, to which suddenly there are prioritized road projects that have to do with other districts altogether that were deleted. And anyhow, it's a baffling and mystical process by which every year the departments get their priorities listed in the budget, but the neighborhoods don't. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And something that I've noticed since the state has had less funding available for projects that the community councils have been advocating for, several times they had put items in to be funded that had actually already been completed. And so sometimes they need to actually do a drive around and check items and take them off the list so they get updated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. Just a follow on to Mr. Peterson's comment. I think another issue that is in some ways separate from the city, but related to this whole CIP process is I don't think most councils really understand the legislative request process, which is, the legislature's responsibility, but it becomes tricky when you're talking about a road upgrade and whether that's state funding or should be muni funding or where that fits in. And then there's a different timeline for that. I think it's the CAPSIS. But anyway, so I know that's something where you're supposed to work with your legislative office, but I just want to flag that there's no interaction between those two processes. I think very little understanding for most councils of what that looks like, and then gets to the point that you had made before, which is projects may already be funded, or you may be requesting duplicate funding, or there may be something where neither process ends up with that project on the list. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brawley. Go ahead.
Thank you. So, the next, so we got to the steps where the budgets are presented to the public. Typically, I think, actually, if I may back up, There are two presentations to the public from the administration in regards to the upcoming budget year's budgets. The first presentation is what we call the 120-day memo, and it is a very high-level communication that includes typically a preliminary capital improvement budget usually by department and funding source. And it depends on the presentation, but it may not include all of the projects. It is submitted 120 days before the year ends, which is typically September 1st or 2nd. And so by then, a lot of the capital improvement budget is still being, capital improvement program are still being worked through the administration's process. And so that high-level information that is presented on the 120-day memo may not be exactly, it's preliminary and it's still vetted, and then the final proposed capital improvement budget is then submitted 90 days before the end of the year, usually October 2nd or 1st. Yes, sir.
So, Felix, Mr. Rivera, when you were chair, we instituted an additional step to this process. It wasn't a public hearing. No, it was something else altogether. And so I would like you to refresh folks' memory on what that timeline and where that fits and why we did that so that we can begin the process of reiterating it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think what the chair is referencing is, so when I was chair, one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we did to minimize all of these gosh darn amendments at the end of the day was work as early in the process as possible with the administration, both from the operating side as well as the capital side, to let the administration know what our priorities are as the legislative branch and see if they could incorporate them when they start building both the operating and the capital budgets. So for the operating budget, I want to say that we started working with them like in really like June, July timeframe was when we started talking with them. And then the budget, we don't get it until October, right? So that's,
the 120-day letter.
yeah.
It was before the 120-day letter.
Yep. Yeah. So the chair is saying, so the 120-day letter, which is really the first communication we get from the administration on the budget, that really drives what the overarching picture for the budget that the administration is building. And so we need to get our thoughts to the administration before they build the overarching framework for the budget so that they can incorporate our thoughts into it.
And you know, in an environment of collaboration, that's a really great tool because then the budget is much more likely to be supported mutually. There is a strict governing argument that the 120-day letter is the mayor's under the charter and the separation of powers. That's 100% true. And there's nothing that stops a working relationship from ensuring that that initial step has initial buy-in. And so we'll be having conversations over the next several months about how to ensure that that step gets thought through to ensure that the process is less bumpy if at all possible. Thank you, Ms. Bonzo.
Thank you. And if I may, I will continue. So the budget that's presented at 90 days before the end of the year is called the mayor's proposed budget. And it is usually a publication that we deliver hard copy to the assembly members and to the libraries. And also we make it available online to the public. It does go in detail. So what's included in this proposed budget document is this narrative overview, and then also the project details grouped by the department that's requesting them. for both the CIB and the CIP. The project details include the description of the project, hopefully timelines, and definitely proposed funding sources. And then so that's available. And then continuing on with the timing and the process, where we're going to get deeper into the details. So so we were looking at a high-level graph picture of the budget process. We also provide a calendar that has specific events at specific times or target times for completion. And this calendar gets into the details of the specific dates when things are due. And if you'll look at, and if I may back up a little bit, when we do send this, in OMB, we'll send this calendar out to the departments, including and the legislative branch. And that calendar does include dates when the departments are supposed to get their submissions into the administration that then becomes part of this compiled mayor's proposed budget. If we look at this calendar, you can see that after the budget is available to the public of October 1st or 90 days before the year is over, then we'll introduce it to the assembly along with some assembly documents that are up for the assembly's approval. And that's usually the first assembly meeting in October. And then the budgets typically go through 2 assembly meetings where there's public hearings. And then the final assembly meeting where these are featured typically is the last assembly meeting in November, where the assembly may amend and approve the proposed budgets. And that's just a high-level process. The administration will also, in October, backing up, do 2 work sessions, typically one for the operating budget and typically one for the capital. And then typically in November, the assembly will then hold a work session for their amendments.
Mike? What I like about this calendar is that if you notice the little letters in the column A, B, C, the next to, not far right, but the next one over, those A, B, C, those correspond on the back to the charter and code citations. And that's
Can
important.
you show us what that page looks like?
Okay, so
There's
this
a lot
is
of
this
pages.
page,
Okay.
everybody, right? But if you look right here, it has A, B, C in the second to right column. And those correspond to the charter and code citations, which are important for this group in terms of what you might change in the future, is to know right where these are coming from. Charter, of course, requires a vote of the people. The code stuff is just an amendment to the code. So I like those in particular because some of these deadlines are charter dictated or code dictated, and everybody has to comply with them. Some of them are available for sort of ready change, others are not. Thank you.
So Dee, if you don't mind, or maybe this isn't the right time, but A, B, C, and D, what's the key information about each of those?
Well, A is that 120-day memo when the preliminary budget is presented to the assembly. And so that relates back to, that's by a code section where that's discussed, provides additional information.
Right, and so in black right there, it says that at least 120 days before the end of the fiscal year, a letter has to come. And so what's important about that is basically 4 months before the end of the year, they have to deliver us the draft budget. That's the critical deadline under A. B. I guess I could do it. It's 90 days right there. So in order for the 6-year fiscal program, no later than 90 days before the end of the fiscal year, it has to be submitted to us. After that, it's late and we have a problem. Before that is not a problem, but after that is a problem. Same under the operating, same deadline. Then the budget hearings, we have to have 2 budget hearings, meaning we open the public hearing, we close the public hearing, and then we do it at the next meeting. We open the public hearing and we close the public hearing. And I think there has been a time when we did a 3rd one just for fun and entertainment, I guess. Well, so the public could have an opportunity to be heard. Sorry. And then finally, there's this 21 days prior to the end of the fiscal year's D, we have to have a passed adopted budget. And if we don't have a passed adopted budget, what happens?
I actually can't remember what the remedy was when that doesn't happen.
I believe that the mayor's budget goes into effect. And so it's our duty to get that work done in a timely manner, in a way that is to our need, because we are the appropriators. And so I could be wrong on that. Maybe someone could fact check me, but that's my understanding, is if it's not done by that day, it goes into effect. And that's because, and we've had this fight before a little bit, poor OMB has to actually implement into SAP and the various tools our budget. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's a very complex document, and they actually have to have people ready to be paid the first day of the year. And so those timelines are essential for the good, orderly operation of our government.
That was nicely done, thank you. And what does drive this calendar is the deadlines that we work back from to set these calendars. Thank you. So that basically went through the whole approval, or the development and approval process of the capital improvement budget and capital improvement program. As noted earlier, the projects included in these budgets have funding sources, allowable funding sources identified with them. So when the capital improvement budget is approved, the projects that are identified to be funded with bonds then typically become the starting point for the bond propositions for the following year. So we see, back to this grid sheet, the second set of blocks that starts with bonds, that really is either in next year for the year we just went through the process for, or the previous year's bond proposition. So this year, right now, the bond propositions that were just approved by the voters were part of, somehow, last year's 2023 process that started back in March.
Marilyn, is that because the bonds are basically paying for the capital projects? I mean, it's voter approval that you expend money on the capital projects that were approved way back in this 21 days before the end of the year, approved CIB published, right? So that approves a bunch of projects, and then there are bonds to implement that, to get the voters' approval for those bonds.
Correct. We do have, so then once the bonds are approved, so the bond package is typically based on the approved budget, and then it goes through another assembly process to then be approved to be put on the proposition to the voters. The voters, if those propositions are approved by the voters, then the projects that were approved then are made available to spend by the departments that will work on those projects, those capital projects.
Arlen, I want to interrupt there again. So this is historically an area of great contention, and it's good to understand what she's saying is that there are projects that get funded in the previous year bond that go into the departments to do the work. Then we have the CIB, which is next year's work plan. And then we have the CIP, which is the next 5 years out. And projects are movable by the assembly across those various timelines. But what we have to consider, and it's easy to forget, we could move everything from the 5 years into year this and then send it out. But there's only so many staff And there's only so much workforce and bandwidth to actually develop and build projects to success. So the purpose of that looking out 5 years is to make sure that our priorities are established, the public is heard, and they're, again, orderly implementation. And so I would always like to have my projects this year on the bond and funded and going. But that's not always the best way for it to work. And so this process is how we see the workflow of our staff at the Muni over the next 5 to 6 years. So it's a higher level look at that, but that's the purpose of this process: funding and workforce and planning.
Nicely said again. Thank you. So one other thing, once the capital projects are then in the works, another item that will come to the assembly in regards to those projects are actual ordinances and instruments to get the bond issuances. But those are always for bonds that were approved by the voters in some year or another. The issuances are typically determined by how the departments can and want to spend, work those projects. So we typically don't want to borrow, if we had $1 million project and we don't expect it to be fully, and we don't expect to spend the whole million in 1 year, we expect to spend it maybe in 3 different years. The bond issuance for that project may be a third of $1 million this year, a third of $1 million next year, a third of $1 million the third year. So those bond issuances are just based on how those projects are working through completion.
Marilyn, I don't know if you saw this. This I got from Ross, who was not available for today, but it's right. I'm sorry. It's a checklist for bond propositions. And it's sort of, what Marilyn was just describing was, well, from 7 on down. 7, you're figuring out debt service and mill rates. 8, bond council writes the ordinance AMC to place bond ballot propositions on the ballot. Do you guys see this? It looks like it's just one page checklist for bonds. Okay. And again, this was generated by Ross, so not Marilyn's office, but it goes through what, I think that's true, what the bond process, and there's a lot of steps to it, lots of ordinances, loading to the SAP, bond council writes an ordinance, requests Assembly's authorization to issue the bonds. So even once the bonds go on the ballot and they're approved by the voters, there's another long process. And I'm sure we'll mention bond council at some point in this process. With respect to bond council, they have to review all the bond documents and their outside counsel. And we have a very limited ability to make changes to those documents because they're approved. And the whole theory is because that bond council then writes an opinion so that when we sell municipal bonds or issue municipal bonds, we're not misrepresenting anything to the public. So that's a fairly involved process. There's some limitations. But anyway, the checklist here, we wanted to give you all these materials so you can look at them in your own time, but there's a lot of steps to the bond process. You're not involved with too many of them once they go to the voter. That OMB comes back with you with bond council for appropriation, I guess is the main one. Chris?
Please. Oh, Mr. Go ahead.
This is more issue specific, but so I know we had an issue out in Eagle River, which I'm sure you're aware of in terms of the bond. Kevin might be able to speak to this a little bit more fully than I, but essentially we ended up with an area specific bond that was supposed to be uni-wide. And so can you tell us what happens when a mistake happens like that? And what are the remedies for an issue like that?
Are you aware of the specific circumstances?
I am not.
Okay,
I do
yeah.
not know. at
So
this time.
basically what happened is in the process of establishing the bond, we had sent forward to us the bond proposal for a piece of equipment for Chugiak fire. It was a truck, I think. Maybe it was an engine, but I think it was a truck. And the document that was sent forward to us had it set as a local funded project. But generally speaking, or maybe it was an ambulance, because it's an area-wide expense, so an EMS expense that should have been sent to us in a form that was an area-wide expense. And it, of course, nobody from the community notified us until after we had already forwarded the ballot packages south and was too late to make any changes. So the voters approved the bond, but the community, I believe, and Kevin can speak to this maybe more, is of the posture, let's not buy that piece of equipment. So what happens in a case where there is an accident in the language where the voters approve a bond, but it wasn't for exactly what was intended?
That was a question to me.
Basically, if you know the answer. If you don't know, that's okay.
I can,
I think the answer is we don't have to issue the bonds,
correct.
and then the funds just sit there in an account that could be issued for other similar projects.
Sir, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, so I can guess, and I will not say that this is exactly what will happen, but this would be my supposition of what will most likely happen, and I will defer to attorneys if I'm wrong. Yes, what I would suspect of this issue, we will most likely, if it is, and it sounds like it is, if it is determined that it is not a project that the administration or the assembly wants to go forth with, we will not then appropriate those bonds amounts. And so a project will not start. So the appropriation is part of this process. I think it's, so once the bonds are approved by the voters, then, like I said, we appropriate the dollars so that they can be spent. But I would suspect we won't take that step. And then if that step's not taken, we won't even look at any issuance. We won't look at, there won't be any budget to spend against. So it would basically die, but I will stop there.
No, and that actually raises up an interesting, lifted up a level question that I think you could probably answer pretty well. So the process from voter to those ordinances you mentioned, to issuance of bonds, that might take several years. Can you just describe how that works, kind of why, if you know, like for those steps? What are the mechanics of going from we've approved an item to go on the bond, the voters have approved it, like that?
Okay. I do believe it is nicely lined out here. I believe it is, but I can elaborate if you'd like me to. From my perspective in budget, all the technical bits. So what we look to see what propositions passed. We then create an assembly resolution with sections that say that we're appropriating the bond dollars, X dollars for this purpose to this fund and this department. And then supporting that will be an AM that has the budget details for that project, where you could identify that project in SAP, and then also a fund cert line where the CFO says, yes, we have that funding source. And then usually with the bond appropriations, we'll have a project list attached. And that project list is typically the same list that was presented on the proposition. Once, so typically those bond propositions, I think they're over $500,000. And so they would require a public hearing. And so we would probably introduce them on one assembly meeting, hopefully the first one in May. And then you'll probably see them in public hearing, the second assembly meeting in May, and then hopefully take action. Once that action is taken, approved, hopefully approved by the assembly, once it's approved by the assembly, then OMB will work with the departments to load those budgets into SAP. Once those budgets are loaded into SAP, they can start putting their purchase orders against those budgets and pro cards and labor and so forth to attain the approved goals of those projects. Then later in the year, we get to where the folks in public finance are evaluating the issuance of the bonds, they will work with the departments and look and see what has been spent and what is projected to be spent the next year. And then they'll take those amounts and then develop a bond issuance, I believe, an ordinance that will then go to the assembly for approval. Once that's approved, we'll get the cash in, or the cash in from the sale of that issuance, and then that will show as revenues against those projects that were deemed that we needed to issue those dollars against.
Marilyn, I think that's very helpful information. Then it goes to construction and that process reiterates. So that's helpful. So that description ties to this table. This is the detail, and that's how you make sense of it. Thank you.
And if I can just point out, one of the most salient deadlines for the assembly is that the introduction of these bonds are, it's generally they're introduced the first meeting in January, and then there's public hearing, second meeting, and the final action by the assembly has to be 70 days before the election. That 70 days is in code, but it's largely driven by what the time it takes to mail out notices to the voters of these elections. So it's not a soft deadline. They have to be, there's some squiggly stuff in there about if there's a veto or reconsideration, but other than that, final action on these bonds must be at least by the assembly must be at least 70 days prior to the election. There's not much movement there. And that's something, by the way, about all these deadlines. They're again, they go OMB and they go from backwards. They figure out what are the ultimate deadlines. But anyway, the bonds deadline, very, very important. And we can get into it now or later about trying to amend bonds at the last minute, what happens. And I don't know how much more, Marilyn, you have here before we get into that particular issue.
I have nothing else unless there's questions.
There's one more if no one does. It's what is the role of bond counsel?
Well, I mean, I think we pay them very big money to receive money. It's their reputation which helps to sell the bonds. I mean, because they are doing all sorts of due diligence information. So there's a number of legal steps that they do for us, and they review. And of course, they have to do a lot of reviewing that. They technically generate these bonds, what they look like, the bond propositions. And when they do this, so this is important for everybody to understand, is right at the end of, here it's in December on this, back to this page, the overall thing. When the CIP is published, the approved one, and theoretically the budget's being approved right about that same time, end of November, early December. Well, what happens is when that happens, then that information OMB gets, and they package it up. They have to figure out mill rates, and so there's it's not just, someone wants $40 million. They have to figure out how that affects mill rates, because on those bonds, it says how it affects a mill rate in your community for every 100,000. This would raise your taxes this much. What's the operating stuff, what's above and what's below the tax cap, which will be another interesting presentation to you at some point. So it's not just that, okay, we got the budget done Friday. Marilyn can send it down to the bond council on Wednesday. There's a lot more. Okay, so maybe they send it down 2 weeks later to bond council. So that bond council starts preparing at end of December, give them a week. Most of their stuff is template really, which is then reviewed by attorneys. But so you don't even have all of that's not even the final bonds. It's not even prepared till the end of December. And yet it has to be introduced really the first week of January. So there's almost no time to do any amendments, just time wise. And then the other thing for bond counsel is that she has taken, we've had this person for 15, 20 years. She has taken the position that you can't amend things in the title of a bond. And so, and for various reasons, there's a legal thing to that. But then that became problematic because last year, and should we just get into the Parks and Rec bonds? What happened there?
Sure.
Well,
Sure.
I mean, so all of a sudden, and this also had to do with some of Pete's projects. I don't know when. I think both. And I don't have all the emails. I think both Chris and Pete had been contacting either OMB or someone in late November saying, hey, we want to make some changes to the CIB. I don't think that was formalized. Meanwhile, the process is going forward. And it wasn't part of the approved CIB. It would have come as an amendment. But if you're going to amend a CIB that just went in at the end of November, December, that's a 2-meeting process or a 2-step process. You can't even amend that till the end of December is my thinking. So how in the world does bond council then generate the bonds by the first week in January? And I think that's sort of what happened. But I know Chris is going to correct me.
So
Go ahead.
no, I won't correct you, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because in this case, the parks bond was made very small. It didn't have any of the projects in it that were in the CIB except a couple that somebody somewhere wanted. And then they put a not to exceed statement in the title, which made it impossible to proceed with that bond with any change. And we tried everything we could do to ensure that we had an average park bond instead. And so what we ended up having to do, and it took some torturous legal analysis to get there, was create a concurrent special election, which has a different set of timelines. And yet still there are those who argue bond counsel may not be fully comfortable putting their reputation on the sale of those bonds, because they might argue that they were done with a different timeline than the code required. There might be some anyhow. So the whole point I would like people to take away with is that for bonds, time is of the essence and last minute changes are not realistic.
And I would say pay special attention on the CIB to what projects are listed there, that approving it and then thinking, oh, I can amend this later. That's not true. You're not going to have the time to amend that. So it's sort of, and I've never worked with the CIB. To me, it heightens the importance of really looking at that document. You get the preliminary on the September 1st and the proposed CIB on October 1st. Is really pay attention to those projects. And Pete, I don't know if you can add a little bit what happened. You want to do the Mokay, there are projects and how that slipped through or didn't slip through, what happened there. And we were able to accommodate Pete because of being able to sort of switch numbers around. But Pete, do you mind it? What happened? I mean.
Well, I actually had started talking to the Parks and Rec Department about making some improvements to Mulcahy Stadium, and we met down there, and the facilities people's estimates were really high. We're talking 800,000 at least, and I'm going that this is going to put the park bond in a situation where it may not pass, and so. We had to come up with a different alternative. And so I eventually came up with an idea accidentally by seeing something on a TV program where they were doing one of these weekend remodels of somebody's house, and they leave for the weekend, they come back, they got a whole new house type of deal. And watching that episode, this guy says, oh, well, we don't want to do this and this and this because we don't know what we're going to get into, and it could be much more expensive and much more time consuming. So let's just knock this wall out and add a new section. And I'm going, oh, we could do that. And so that's why it got added a little bit late. And then there was the not to exceed clause that had everybody trying to figure out what was going to happen. And so that delayed it for a couple of weeks, over a month, just because the legal department didn't have very many ideas either. So anyway.
So that was late into the game, right? And so, but we were able to, I think what you did was sort of switch projects from one fund to another. There was some way that we didn't have to change the title for your thing, or it fell within under that.
Yeah, it was, we pulled out a project and replaced it at the same amount is what happened. And so it didn't change the title, just changed a subordinate set of language. I have a few people in the queue. Anna?
Yeah, thanks. I just had a general question, or just to confirm about bonds. So my understanding is often there's staff or a portion of staff time written into bonds as well to basically carry those forward. Is that correct?
OEM.
It's maintenance.
Maintenance.
Yeah, so if you decide to build a road, what would be the maintenance on that? And the reason that maintenance is above the tax cap, right? They can tax for that little bit, and whereas the bonds aren't.
I don't think it's above the cap. The cap is like mystical voodoo magic to me, so I've never quite figured out how it operates. But doesn't the bond create a one-time increase of the cap, the OEM portion?
So the scheduled debt service to pay for the issuances of the bonds are included in the tax cap in what we call the debt. There's a debt line. Then in addition to that, within the tax cap, so let me back up. That line there that has the increase to the tax cap for that set scheduled bond payments, so that becomes a one-to-one increase to taxes to cover that debt. Then in addition, in the tax cap, there may be a voter-approved operations and maintenance row. And in that row may be a dollar amount that relates to O&M that was on propositions that were approved. And what we do to add that O&M to the tax cap, and again, once that O&M is on the tax cap, it gets paid for with tax dollars one-to-one. So what we do internally is have a schedule of all voter-approved O&M, and we send it to the departments to determine when that O&M will be used, in which year. And then the year that it is determined that O&M will be needed, then we increase the cap. So the O&M, operations and maintenance, may be typically you have your standard operations for your departments, and if they're refurbing a road, you don't really expect an increase in the cost because it's the same roads that we've been maintaining all these years. But if you have, say, a new piece of something, a new vehicle in addition to the current fleet, a new building in addition to what we're already maintaining, that's where we may present an additional operations and maintenance cost, because that's in addition to what's already included in the current operations.
And the key to that is it has to be in the bond issue to the voters. When the voters get that language, when they mark yes, that language has to be there. Otherwise, the O&M piece isn't allowed.
And just to clarify too, so these are also, when talking about staff, it's still full-time municipal staff that a portion of their cost is being paid for through those bonds if they're working on those projects. And so I'm not talking about construction workers, I'm talking department staff, or is that incorrect? Ongoing, okay. Okay.
And I think the car is an interesting example because eventually the car is gone, right? So there is some up and down in the context of cars, but roads are slightly different. So you build a new road, there's going to be, Dean, you're next, there's going to be a slight increase in O&M, the operations and maintenance, that will ride with that for the time of that road. And we don't generally remove roads, right? But it's not going to be in the bond for repairs, just the new, right? And so it's a little bit of a moving, tricky thing. Thank goodness for spreadsheet people. So, Dean?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I was going to comment on something earlier, but I just wanted to add on this O&M discussion. The road example is a good one because I believe project management and engineering and maintenance and operations, they have these formulas they use for an extra mile of road is going to cost, an additional mile of road is going to cost X dollars of maintenance and operations if it's a collector or Ontario or so forth. So they have these guidelines and texts that are really helpful for that. And as well as if you are constructing a new building from a bond issuance, right, you've got, of course, the maintenance of the building, the upkeep and all that. Anyway, I asked to speak more to some comment earlier about the bond council and their putting their reputation on the line when they're like authorizing bonds to be sold and go forward when they don't follow the usual process. And in my discussions with bond council, I understood it as bond council, they've got their legal duty and obligation to evaluate the bonds. And if they've gone through the usual process, and the goal is to have a very low risk bond, right? So that banks will buy them, they can be sold. Buyers have a lot of confidence. They rely on bond counsel's opinion of the bond. And bond counsel has to say it didn't go through the usual timeline that the municipality has used for over 30, 40 years. It's gone through a different process to go to the voters. And so that just says it's not zero risk. There's a little more risk there because they can be challenged. It's not going through a process. So it's not so much, I think, as bond counsel's reputation online, that bond counsel has to say something was done differently. So the risk level is a little higher than zero risk. And that's how she explained it to me.
So there's a whole conversation there's surely no one here prepared to speak about. And that's the bond rating conversation. And so I would imagine that's well outside of your wheelhouse, Marilyn.
Thank you.
That's a fair answer. Okay. And so we will return to that conversation at a time with the right folks in the room, because when Dean talks about a little more risk, that's benchmark against our rating, which is annually reviewed, and it affects the cost, or at some point it might affect the saleability of those bonds. And so there's a lot that goes into that, and that is a whole other conversation. Ms. Dern had her hand up, but first, Dee.
Can I just say Ross Griswold from the CFO's office has said that he'd be glad to present on debt and investment.
Yep. Yeah, so another day, but there's so much at play. Robin?
This is kind of an adjunct question, and I'm not sure how to even pose it. But when we talk about roads in particular, and then we think about how many private roads are built, and then I consider how those private roads intersect with public roads, and how does that even get compensated for in the ongoing budget? I'm failing to understand how that gets planned in. Thanks.
I am not an expert on road maintenance, but I will say that our city is a very complex city geographically. So private roads, I do not believe that the city maintains, but there are what we call limited road service areas, limited rural road service areas. And if you look at a map of the city, and actually we present them in our budget books, you will see that there are different what we call service areas that have their own maintenance needs. So the road service areas, we have the area-wide service, we have the service area, we have Anchorage Park service area, we have the five. So may I back up? And this is a moving from capital to operations budget, well, the whole city. So we have 5 major funds: the area-wide fund, the Anchorage Fire Service Area, the Anchorage Police Service Area, the Anchorage Park Service Area, and then we have the Anchorage Road Service Area, Roads and Drainage Service Area. And those are geographic areas that have assessed values within them, and they also have costs associated with the maintenance of those. Then we also have the rural road service areas, probably up on the hillside and so forth, and those have certain properties assigned to them and then costs assigned to them. With those rural road service areas, a lot of the times, so in order for us to get money, in order for us to get the tax dollars to pay for that maintenance during first quarter, we work with operations and maintenance, Maury Robinson. He then works with those service area boards to determine how much mills they want to assess to the taxpayers in those areas. Then he lets us know, and then we put those mills on the ordinance to set the mill rates for the city. So so to get to the mills for those, so to get to the taxing for those service areas, usually they're set at a codified mill rate, maximum mill rate, or the board mill rate. And so we take the assessed value of the properties assigned to that area, I think divide by the mill to get the allowable budget. And so that's how we get from I think I went too far to get to the budget. You didn't ask about well, actually what it does is, so I should continue on with that. So each service area has its own fund and its own mill rate is set for that process. And then that mill rate is equates to, based on the assessed value of the property, equates to a tax cost. And then that tax cost is what we get from the taxpayers. And then that is what can be used to maintain that specific area. So a lot of those areas may have savings that they didn't use in prior years, fund balance. And so if this year that set budget amount isn't sufficient for maintenance in this year, then the department may work with the board to then do a supplemental appropriation by fund balance for that specific fund/service area to increase that budget. And then if the budget is not fully used in that specific fund for those costs, but we collected taxes for it, then that extra taxing then just falls to fund balance for next year's. So all
I'm
of our
going to jump in there because we have approximately 20 minutes and just say Midtown, North Anchorage, West Anchorage really have no LRSAs. This is an issue that's really germane to South Anchorage and West Anchorage and a tiny corner of East Anchorage. And it's a pretty specific function of the muni, and they're self-funded because they opted not to be within the larger road service area. And there's a proposal that's been discussed about dividing the road service area elections off of the main muni election and doing them in the fall, because the complexity of all of the road service areas creates a scenario where we have to have between 150 to 200 different ballot styles. If we eliminated that, we could probably get down to closer to 50 in our main election, and then all of those sub little elections could happen. Cleaner, better, probably more engagement, but that's policy call for later. And so it's the point, the big picture is it's complex and doesn't even get into the service areas that are muni-wide, and then the service areas that are road-wide, and special taxing power that's allowed to pay for area-wide issues for a road service area, if it's life and safety, anyhow, all complex. And so with 20 minutes left, I want to make sure we save some time for new members to ask questions and you are able to finish what you have. Are we good? You there? Okay, so really, okay, Kevin.
Yeah, that's what we do with our road service areas out in our park service. We get a budget. We actually put in about an extra 10% in there, which is a carryover that we build up in our general fund, and then we can use that for CIP projects so we can fix stuff without having to bond. That's the ideal situation. So to build off that, the next thing I have is it'd be really interesting to hear from bond counsel, as we do these budget amendments and as we go through this process, just what our decisions are doing, because it looks to me like we've got a couple things. We've got, not just lawsuits with contractors, but OSHA violations and a bunch of stuff. And I imagine on a bigger picture of being able to bond and people who want to accept the debt of Anchorage as a whole, it'd be interesting to get their feedback more often on what that looks like, not just our bond rating, but the decisions that we're making and as we amend the budget on what that looks like for future bonding.
Yeah, and I don't think that's the bond counsel's role. I think that's probably Ross and the Treasury's role to help us understand the way these things are financed, maybe not Treasury, how these things interplay. So those are good questions, but probably not bond counsel. Bond counsel is pretty specific. And an odd little piece of trivia, apparently we have had the same contract with the same bond counsel at this municipality and city for 70 years, which is wild. It's a long-term relationship. That's at least what was asserted in our conversations last year. Our current bond counsel has only been there for 15 to 20 years for us, which is a very long time. And those those ordinances are the ones that look different than everything else you'll see. So everything looks pretty standard in format of the work we do, a resolution, memo, ordinance, but the bond counsel ones related to those issues all look significantly different. And you'll notice over time what it looks like. So other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any. This is all baffling and it's a lot of information, hard to retain. You'll get it over time through trial and error by running up against brick walls that you can't surmount in the short term. And so that's generally the way we learn. Any closing comments, Marilyn or Dee? Oh, Pete, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that we actually considered electing the road service area boards at community councils to try to reduce the number of ballots that we had to print up, and that actually wasn't we didn't get good feedback from community councils or the road service board areas about that, and so that sort of ended up as a dead end. But yeah, trying to reduce the number of ballots is something that we on the Ethics and Election Committee had been working on for as long as I've been on it, and we've made very little, if any, progress. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think reapportionment last year created a real challenge because the way that the state precinct lines are drawn are different than ours and our boundaries, and it increased substantially the number of ballots to a point where it's becoming unmanageable. And so conversation is not dead. It's just to be TBD. Anyone else? Okay, again, D or Marilyn? Yep.
Thank you. Just if I may, just to let all the folks know that the budget documents are on the muni.org under the Department of Office of Management and Budget. You can look at prior year's budget documents. We do try to include narratives and explanations of the process and other definitions in the budget documents. If you have questions, please do let Courtney or me or our staff know, and we'll do what we can to answer them. Or if you have recommendations to improvements on the documents, we would gladly take them. And a lot of what we do is to satisfy codified requirements. So I do want to thank you for allowing me to present to you today. Thank you.
Please go ahead, Ms. Bronca.
I was going to ask on the one page here, general obligation bond history. In several of the years, there's no Parks and Recreation, Library, Museum. Are those years that there was no bonds at all for? Wow. Okay.
Is that no bond or years where they failed?
Correct. No voter approved, but they may not have been presented or they may have
Right.
been not voted.
It could have
in.
been either
Yes.
scenario.
Yeah.
So I don't want to presuppose it was one thing. It could have been either. Okay, so hearing no other inputs, we have until 2:50 before we convene for our last work session of the week. So we're adjourned.